7.2 million, they're now 7.5 million. I'd like you to explain how they're coming down.
Because they were coming down from where they were when they were higher.
7.2.
And they're now on their way down.
He can role-play Margaret Thatcher all he wants, but when it comes to Europe, his answer's the same. Yes, yes, yes!
I'm not going to answer the question because the question is, will you shut up, man?
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman. Election Special.
What do you think when I say the following three words? Televised, leaders, debates. Perhaps a grainy black and white image of two American politicians back in 1960, engaging in a verbal duel that comes to define politics in the television age.
I'm not satisfied when we have over $9 billion worth of food, some of it rotting, even though there is a hungry world, and even though 4 million Americans wait every month for a food package from the government, which averages 5 cents a day per individual. I saw cases in West Virginia, here in the United States, where children took home part of their school lunch in order to feed their families, because I don't think we're meeting our obligations towards these Americans.
I think we disagree on the implication of his remarks tonight and on the statements that he has made on many occasions during his campaign to the effect that the United States has been standing still. We heard tonight, for example, the statement made that our growth in national product last year was the lowest of any industrial nation in the world. Now, last year, of course, was 1958. That happened to be a recession year. But when we look at the growth of GNP this year, a year of recovery, we find that it's 6 9/10% and one of the highest in the world today. More about that later.
Or maybe those words conjure up an image of hyper-competitive politicians speaking over one another, a sound montage of futile disagreeableness. CBBS meets politics.
You have no workforce strategy, you have no industrial strategy, you have no
Are you talking to me or Rishi?
Thank you.
Are you talking to me or Rishi? Because that is exactly...
You have been in an election campaign. What's your plan?
Thank you.
You haven't got one.
Thank you, Angela Rayner.
Or maybe you recall grand rhetorical claims that turned out to be rather more complex on inspection.
We vote leave and take back control. I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
Over the past half-century, politics and television have come to exist in a state of mutual dependence, with the former providing the raw materials for a public agenda, and the latter packaging and delivering them to mass audiences. For most of us, television is our best means of exposure to people, situations and perspectives that are beyond the horizon of our immediate experience. There's abundant research showing that it is from television that most citizens receive their political information. Television might not tell us what to think, but it certainly tells us what to think about. From mundane local news to momentous global events, television provides interpretive narratives and stimuli to interpersonal discussion that shape our understanding of social reality. So it makes sense that at moments of great democratic choice, like a general election, we turn to television to dramatise that choice for us, to provide a national gathering place for reflective debate. It took 50 years after the first US televised presidential debate in 1960 for Britain to catch up. 15 years after those first British TV debates, they're now a central feature of every campaign. It's hard to imagine elections without them in one form or another. But now that we have them, let's think carefully and, if possible, creatively about what we want from them. What are they for? Are they really about winning or losing, or might we hope for more civically meaningful outcomes? Can they tell people something that they didn't know before? How can we know who or what to believe in these debates? Have broadcasters got the format right? Or after half a century since Kennedy debated Nixon and 15 years since Gordon agreed with Nick, should we be looking for new ways of staging these public contests of ideas? Well, to help us think this through, let's talk to a politician who took part in televised election debates. Former Liberal Democrat leader Tim Farron. Tim, we've been talking about the televised debates today. If you were speaking to someone who knows nothing about our political culture, how would you explain what a televised debate is? What's it supposed to do?
Well, first of all, we didn't used to have them until very recently. And one of the reasons why is that if you're the Prime Minister, you don't want to concede equality in a contest to your opponent. So there were no leaders' debates really until 2010. There were lots of interviews, and the leaders of parties would not disappear and hide from view, quite the opposite. But going up against each other during the campaign was not a thing we did in the UK. In America, of course, most presidential elections there would be, and if you're head-to-head, occasionally you might have a third-party candidate like Ross Perot, and you get three people on the podium. But apart from that, that's what we'd see from overseas. But in 2010, Gordon Brown, who was then the defending Prime Minister, it's important to remember that at the point we're talking, Gordon Brown ended up with the worst result of any incumbent Prime Minister since universal suffrage. And so he had nothing to lose. And so he conceded that he had debates. And at that point, Britain was, a 2.5, maybe 3-party system. The Labour Party in power, Conservatives in opposition, and a strong third party in the Liberal Democrats. There wasn't anybody really competing for third place, shall we say. And so you got three men in suits debating on the television. And arguably the 2010 election was transformed by those leaders' debates. Mm-hmm. And it's made everybody nervous about them since. The Dem leader at the time, Nick Clegg, was judged to have played a blinder and almost certainly prevented a very significant Conservative majority from happening by basically stealing the change mantle from the Conservative insurgent official opposition. So ever since then, people have been trying to work out what does that all mean. Incumbent prime ministers, again, don't like doing debates unless they think it's in their interest. And also the fact the Liberal Democrats then, ironically, having got into government after that set of debates, of course, lost more than half their support, and other third parties began to emerge and become really very significant. We saw the rise of the Scottish National Party to major party status, the Green Party winning its first seat, the existence of Plaid Cymru in Wales, and then it keeps changing its name, but the kind of party to the right of the Conservative Party, which Nigel Farage is normally involved with, UKIP, Brexit Party reform. So you suddenly see there's a flowering of about 7 vaguely serious parties. And the BBC and other broadcasters feeling that they then got to give a platform to all of them. And so when I was leader, which is the time after Nick Clegg, I wasn't in a 3-way debate. I think I had to take part in at least one which was 7-way and one that was 5-way. And I'm not saying that they are not helpful, because there are moments to shine or to bomb for a candidate, or for a leader. But in an hour-long or an hour-and-a-half-long programme, I'm not quite sure how much you get to see of somebody who is one of 7 getting their, 15 seconds of fame.
So in those 2017 debates, when you were standing there waiting for the lights to go on, so to speak, and the cameras to roll, what was the last thing that you said to yourself in terms of, don't forget to do this, mate?
Well, there are particular lines, you want to deliver. There's also how one is as a person. And I think to a degree, I've done lots of question time programmes in the past. And the first time I did question time, I revised far too hard. I kind of tried to get a load of information into my head. And I got some good advice after that from none less than Charles Kennedy. And it was simply basically, you don't need to know every detail. You just need to know what you genuinely think. What's your opinion on the 10 or 12 most likely things that would come up? And I thought it was the best advice. And on top of that, well, just be reasonable and be yourself. But of course, when you're in a 7-way debate, and I was in a position where the Liberal Democrats were going into a general election in our weakest position we've ever been in. And so the opportunity to have publicity was very limited for us in that 2017 election. So you've just got to get your message across quickly. For us in that election, we'd taken the gamble to be the anti-Brexit party. So we just, but when you're a smaller party, people aren't necessarily aware of that. I mean, even at that point, only 25% of the electorate knew the Lib Dems were against Brexit. And it's the only thing we talk about, for pity's sake. And so you've just got to keep talking about it. You wouldn't. People get irritated and ask why Keir Starmer keeps talking about his dad being a tool maker. Well, apparently now only 30% of the electorate know that. And it turns out that they like that. Yes, he's a knight of the realm. Yes, he's a very accomplished barrister, and he's the leader of the opposition and maybe soon prime minister. But he comes from working class stock. And so if you are the people who pay attention, we might be fed up of hearing those sort of messages. But my sense is that by the time people who are really interested in politics have got fed up of a line, the 80% who aren't have just started to notice it. Right. And so you've got to, so that there's particular lines that you'll be practicing, that people knew what your position would be. The other thing is just an attempt to try and cast yourself as in terms of character. So for me, I spent a lot of time talking about my background, So I was not a toolmaker's son, but I was from a single parent family and had, shall we say, a less privileged upbringing than all of my opponents on that stage. And I think at a time of austerity and poverty and need, people understanding that one of you on that stage actually understood where they were coming from was the thing we thought was important. But bear in mind, you get a minute to answer a question, and you've just got to try to project character as much as you can do any substance.
That's fascinating. Tim, who do you think you were mainly talking to in that debate? I mean, clearly you have the studio audience, you have the home audience, you have the moderator who has some degree of control over what's going on. Who do you have in mind? Or did you have an individual person in mind?
It's funny, when I do question time, my view is also you're talking to that audience, because people sat at home watching can tell whether or not you're a live human being who's actually interacting with people in front of you, and that therefore vicariously becomes you interacting with them. But then again, I will always have in mind my own constituency and people back home, people I actually know. And you don't want to be somebody who, as I said earlier on, you need to be yourself. I would never want to be thought of as somebody who's putting on an act, right? Because there'll be people watching who know me and know that's not what you're like.
I want to ask you about this very peculiar phenomenon, or at least it's a peculiar one to me, and that is the spin room, where all the party supporters are rushing around trying to grab hold of journalists, spreading their own narrative. I mean, like a lot of other things in politics, does this actually matter? Or is it a sort of pointless ritual?
Again, leaders' debates are quite a recent thing in this country. They're only, 14 years old. I was in the spin room for the first ever leaders' debate. In 2010, I went down to Manchester, not too far from my constituency, and was at that first debate, the one that Nick Clegg absolutely did smash out of the park, which changed the shape of the election. So it was a piece of cake, really. I didn't have to say anything. I just walked along and agreeing with the journalists that Nick had smashed it out of the park. So that's the only time I've ever been a spinner. So what would you say? I mean, I think that if you've got a whole bunch of journalists who are going to write up a debate and cast what's happened, I suppose the exposure to people who are there on behalf of the candidates, if you like, on behalf of the leaders, to different narratives means the journalists get a sort of fair exposure. But the only thing is then you get herding and people are writing the same thing. Maybe it'd be far better if a dozen journalists were just sat in a room having watched those, however many party leaders there are debating for an hour or whatever it is, and just wrote what they actually thought. And then we compare notes afterwards. That'd be far more interesting. And the danger is you just get, the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph all listen to one narrative, the Guardian, the Mirror listens to another, and so on. And it's and I'm not sure it leads to good journalism. I think it probably just leads to herding. It's perfectly legitimate for a party to try to make sure it gets its message across. This is what Tim said and it's what he meant or whatever. But that's kind of fine. But I'm not sure it leads to a worthwhile record of the event.
Yeah. Is it, in your view, about winning and losing? I mean, we tend to think of this as a horse race, and there's a very kind of crude characterisation of this one won, that one came out terribly, this one might have had a gaffe and it's the end of their career. But it's very rarely like that, is it?
Very, very rarely. I mean, in the current context, the head-to-head between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak the other week, there was an overnight poll, an immediate poll that said that Rishi had won it 51-49. And then polls, and that was kind of the narrative of the evening, that Rishi had done all right. But actually, you looked at other polls, brackets better polls, that came out the following day. That was not the picture. It was more like 60-40 in favour of Keir Starmer, brackets with a lot of don't knows and don't cares. They always say that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. I think we might be, and we all stand to be corrected because we're a good 13 days off the election itself. It's a slight reverse situation at the moment, where I think Keir Starmer is headed to be Prime Minister with a reasonable majority, unless he fouls up. And so that there's a danger that he might foul up, and it could affect how people think. That is possible. And going back to 2010, which I think is the one time leaders' debates really did change the election, it's important not to overstate how important those debates really were, particularly the first one. What normally happens when a Labour government is deeply unpopular, David Cameron, who'd attempted to become the new sort of the Conservative version of Tony Blair, moderated the Tory party, at least in its image. Quite a, capable debater and sort of an attractive candidate in many ways. There was an assumption he'd just win. And Nick Clegg, by basically just being human, by lumping the other two together, and by doing this radical thing of looking at the camera and using people's names, was adjudged to have done by far the best. And what that did, basically, is it prevented a Conservative majority, which was definitely going to happen. We were going to get a Conservative majority of between 40 and 60 in my reading. So Nick Clegg, oddly enough, probably saved a few Labour seats and certainly made sure the Lib Dems were more we were going to do, and prevented David Cameron being Prime Minister on his own. All because he basically stole the change mantle off David Cameron. So that's the one time I've really seen leaders' debate genuinely change things. In the debates I did, if you believe the polls, I won one and came second in the other, and we still got 7.5%. So I'm not convinced they make that much difference.
That's really interesting. A couple of final questions. Now, you're a Liberal with a small L as well as a large L, and Liberals believe in considering the possibility that they're going to hear something, maybe deeply unpopular, unorthodox, even ridiculous, and it convinces them, or they're open to it. Every idea is worth considering. Is that the way debates actually work? I mean, did you hear anything during any of the debates that for a split second made you think, I'm going to reconsider what I was going to say?
So I don't think so. I mean, I think, having said that, I am somebody who does believe it's important to disagree well and to listen to other people's point of view and be careful not to demonise the other. I mean, some people, I think, are nefarious, bad actors, bad faith actors in politics. I do think I come across those. Nevertheless, it's important that we don't just switch people off because we don't like them. It's important to listen. But the leaders' debates aren't really an opportunity to do that. The leaders' debates are a series of, bowled at you that you've got to either just keep off your stumps or maybe occasionally thwack towards the boundary rope. You're not up against the other batsman. You're up against the bowler who is, normally speaking, the questioner or the audience. Occasionally you might get you're allowed to challenge your colleagues, your opponents across the podium, but there's not a lot of that, I don't think. In debate more generally, absolutely, I do listen to what other people say. And in Parliament, I do listen to what other people say. And just in debate in general, I do. As somebody who's a Christian, and one of the things that I think I'm minded is important is that you've got to treat other people with grace and kindness, even and especially when they don't deserve it. And that includes listening to people's points of view, even if you're pretty convinced you're not going to agree with any of it.
Well, you might have plenty of opportunity after the election to do that in Parliament. A final question, Tim. Television debates are obviously not in a vacuum. They're a reflection of the state of democratic discourse more generally, and democratic discourse more generally is in a pretty unhealthy state. Is it inevitable that debates reflect that, or can debates in some ways be used as a way of setting a civic example? I mean, you've said something about that in terms of showing a gracious attitude towards opponents, but I wonder whether there is a possibility that we could see televised debates as a way of somehow nourishing and stimulating democracy.
It would be nice to think that. I think that, so the great Churchill quote, which he may or may not have said, but we'll use it, which that democracy is a terrible system, it's just better than all the alternatives. And I certainly agree with the latter. And I think one of the things that the Western liberal democracies need to understand really, really, really quickly is that our flawed form of government and society is still comfortably the best human form of government, and it's at risk from without and from within, massively at risk in the West. But what's at the heart of some of the failings of democracy is short-termism. That's, I guess, built into, quite rightly, term limits. And they're only over 5 years at the most away from another election here. But there's a greater level of short-termism now. I think that the social media brings many positives and it brings many negatives as well. The old line from Andy Warhol that in the future we'd all be famous for 15 minutes. Well, now we're all famous all the time, if we want to be. And people have the opportunity to express a view. And there's not much moderation of which are the right views and which are the wrong views, although, of course, the social media giants will end up promoting some views or kinds of views over others. And so there is a toxicity. And because it's an impersonal thing, it's just going to road rage on the web, really. And I also come across this other phenomenon that it's a US phrase, but it absolutely applies here, of LARPism, live action role playing. So people who think they're political and aren't really, they're just playing at it. They will emote views, they may post pictures, and they're playing a role, but they're actually not involved in politics at all. But in a peculiar way, they are shaping the narrative, which is very often an angry and simplistic one. So yeah, no, it is. I think the quality of debate is poor. So therefore, one thing I will say for leaders' debates is that they potentially, at least, provide a kind of shared moment of, a collective televisual experience where maybe a few million people are engaging with the same thing at the same time. And that might not be a bad thing. And I certainly think leaders' debates have something to add. I think during an election, it's good that the electorate see the parties putting forward their views and doing so against one another in a competitive way. Because otherwise, all you do is see the stunts that parties organise themselves and the questions that the journalists ask them one-to-one, which is very useful. I thought for what it's worth, the question time one-to-ones in front of an audience, which I remember doing myself in 2017, I think they're really illuminating. I think you really get much more. If you've got half an hour of someone stood before an audience answering a bunch of questions moderated by a decent journalist, you are much more likely to find out about that person, and that person's actually got more opportunity to tell you about them than, seven dwarves all ranting at each other on the stage.
Great note to end on. Tim, thanks for such illuminating answers and for taking the time to talk.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you, Stephen.
So, there we have it. Debate. To dispute about, to argue, to discuss, especially to discuss a question of public interest. That's the Oxford English Dictionary. In its best sense, the term debate refers to an orderly and critical examination of opposing viewpoints. But perhaps, as Tim Farron was suggesting, there's not really much opportunity for that in these debates. Each candidate is so busy pushing their own agenda that they've very little time to really engage with one another's. Debate, at its best, is the absolute antithesis of rough scuffling, vile name-calling, mendacious manipulating, or unfounded asserting. When I think about the image of people debating the issues and values that divide them, what comes to mind are humans exercising their most sophisticated capabilities of setting out transparent and coherent arguments, providing evidence and justifications in support of propositions, listening really carefully to other sides, producing detailed refutations of erroneous arguments, inviting people to use their minds to arrive at valid truths. Yet, conducted well, debate is democracy in its most dignified mode. Given that politics is fundamentally about disagreement, for there wouldn't be politics unless people disagreed about values, preferences and interests. Debate is a space in which such disagreement can be allowed to breathe, as arguments are rehearsed from all sides with a view to reaching some idea of what should and can be done. So how should we judge the value of televised election debates? Not, I would suggest, in terms of winners and losers, of knockout blows, of smart, pithy, memorable one-liners that become tomorrow's fish and chip paper, of supposed gaffes, of flash poll verdicts. Instead, I suggest we should be marking the card of the political debaters on the basis of the following questions. Did viewers become better informed about the political choices before them as a result of what they saw and heard in this debate? How well were key issues in the election set out and addressed? Were principles and policies separating the parties made absolutely clear? Were the qualities and the defects of would-be future national leaders made apparent? And during and after watching, are audience members galvanised to share their opinions with others, whether in their immediate circles or online networks? And are they subsequently motivated to take a further part in the election, including voting? These questions relate not to winners, losers, immediate political effects, but the wider question of civic awareness and behaviour, of how a democracy decides. In most elections since the 1970s, between a quarter and a third of the electorate have not cast a vote at all. Asked why, many say they don't understand the electoral issues. The politicians never seem to address them, or when they do, they simply don't give people enough to make their minds up. Even amongst those who do vote, a significant number pay very little attention to the details of the 6-week election campaign. So if televised debates can offer any kind of substantial contribution to confident choice, then they're performing a useful democratic function. But for democracy to work well, people need to know not only what they are being offered by the competing parties, but whether they can trust that what is on offer can be delivered. Televised election debates succeed or fail depending upon whether there is a culture of trust in democratic politics, whether people believe that there is a meaningful link between the expression of their preferences through voting and the realisation of desired outcomes. And it's in that sense that the question is not simply about whether we have confidence in televised debates as they're run at the moment or as we might run them in the future, but whether we can have confidence in elections as such. And that will be the question considered in the next episode of The Sound of Politics, looking especially at the UK's 2024 election campaign. We'll look at other countries in later episodes. And I want to ask whether, apart from supplying an endless stream of seductive phrases and offers and promises, politicians are satisfying democratic demand for information, for confidence, for efficacy. So join us next time when I'll be discussing with Dorothy Byrne, former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, what the 2024 UK election campaign was really all about.
10.2 million, they're now 7.5 million. I'd like you to explain how they're coming down.
Because they were coming down from where they were when they were higher.
7.2.
And they're now on their way down.
He can role play Margaret Thatcher all he wants, but when it comes to Europe, his answer's the same. Yes, yes, yes.
I'm not going to answer the question because the question is, will you shut up, man?
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman. Election Special.